One of the great joys any traveler can experience is to discover something new that so fires the imagination that they're spurred to investigate their discovery further, leading them down a rich path of excitement, education, and sharing. A couple of memorable times when I've experienced this phenomenon includes my first trip to Malta, where the fantastic history of the Maltese Knights gripped my imagination and my reading habits for weeks. Another time I stumbled across a wooden model of a submarine on the boardwalks of Barcelona, which led me to a book titled Montreal's Dream, which not only fully explained the elaborate submodel on the boardwalk, but also led me to endless speculations as to what might have happened if the Confederacy had procured Montreal subs during the American Civil War. I found myself in similar grips for the past few weeks ever since our guide Hubert Wakeo Kayo, while escorting us to Peru's famous ruins at Machu Picchu, made a surprise stop at Moray. I simply couldn't believe that I'd never heard the story of these fantastic Inca ruins. Moray consists of four terraced depressions extending deep into the northeastern base of Huaynamarca Mountain, roughly 22 miles northwest of Cusco, at an elevation of roughly 11,600 feet above mean sea level. Terraced depression doesn't adequately capture the Moray features any more than deep ditch would adequately describe the Grand Canyon. The Moray site covers about 92 acres, and the concentric terraces, each depression is called a muyu, range from a diameter of about 130 feet in the smallest depression to almost 400 feet in the largest. The largest muyu covers more than 2 football fields when its associated curved ovals are included in the area computations. Upon first sight, the initial impression is one of a gigantic amphitheater set deep into the ground. My first thought was that the entire Roman Colosseum would fit within this giant muyu's footprint, and it nearly would too, although at 144 feet high, the Colosseum would stick up about 24 feet over the rim of the deepest muyu at 120 feet of depth. Even more incredible to me was the fact that these fantastic ruins remained undiscovered by the outside world for 400 years after the Spanish conquest. It was 1931, 20 years after Hiram Bingham discovered Machu Picchu, when American geologist Robert Shippey led an aerial photographic expedition over the Peruvian Andes with his U.S. Navy pilot, Lieutenant George Johnson, and the two men discovered the startling 4 muyus deeply etched into the side of the mountain. Fortunately, since they were on a photographic expedition, Shippey and Johnson were able to record their discovery with a series of remarkable photos, and the mystery of who created the Moray and why was launched. Because the Inca left no written records of the site, they had no written language, no knowledge of the wheel, no metal tools harder than bronze, and no beasts of heavy burden beyond the llama. For the past 83 years, a wide range of adventurers, archaeologists, academics, researchers, and others have tried to unravel the mysteries of the Moray. Many researchers eventually agreed with the hypothesis that the site was an agricultural research center. Agriculture was central to the success of the Inca Empire, and the nearly perfect concentric rows of terraced lawns, each descending deeper into its own microcosm environment, seemed a reasonably pragmatic explanation for why the Inca would invest so much energy in creating such fantastically intricate terraces with their fine stonework, flying stairs, carved water drops, and ceremonial building foundations, all on a space that was much too small to provide adequate area for production farming. The total area of all 4 muyus that could have been used for farming only amounted to a little under 14 tillable acres. Surely 14 tillable acres could be created on the sides of the adjoining slopes much easier than digging a quarry-like pit 120 feet deep into the side of the mountain. In fact, we watched farmers till the slopes above the Moray using 2 bulls to pull a long wooden plow on the day that we visited the site.
Another one, we call them muyuritos. Have a look. Circular terraces and
Yeah.
they go floating steps.
Oh, that's right, yeah, I do see the floating there.
Yeah.
Have a look here. Between those, there are channels for irrigation. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Between the stairs, there.
Yes, okay.
But they didn't finish working on this. Happened that they were working here. This is happening on the early 1500s. And then, conquistadores are arriving here, so they didn't finish building this. But we have a beautiful, beautiful example of how good those guys they were engineering. Have a look. We have one here. The hike that we are doing is here. We start here, going there. You see the train.
Yeah.
There is another one. We call them muyuri.
So the notion that the muyus were created as experimentation centers where Inca agricultural experts could develop appealing and enjoyed fairly wide acceptance. As late as 1989, Peter Frost wrote convincingly of the area as the greenhouse of the Incas, and John Earls in 1999 concurred that it was built as an experimentation and control center. But not everyone agreed with the agricultural theory, especially the locals who had kept the site hidden for 4 centuries. They insisted that the function of the Moray was to serve as religious centers, temples in the earth. Fortunately for us, in 2011, a team of highly respected civil engineers led by Kenneth R. Wright published a definitive work on the subject titled Moray, Inca Engineering Mystery. The book is a wonderful scientific examination of the area and its mysteries, and I, for one, am convinced that the team's findings have merit. The first key to understanding the Moray is to grasp the fact that, in spite of what many claimed as far back as Louis Pardo in 1957, the muyus were not dug out of the earth. Rather, they began as natural geologic sinkholes that were modified by the Inca. Moray is not far from the Maras salt terraces, where naturally salty spring flows are captured in evaporation pools. The entire Maras geologic formation is highly calcitic, with high concentrations of carbonate and calcium sulfate capable of creating sinkholes by dissolving cavities in the underlying rock. Imagine each of the 4 muyus as a funnel, with the calcitic spring water flowing to the center, eating away the bedrock and causing progressively wider cave-ins of the sides. The first steps the Inca did to stabilize the muyus was to place huge andesite boulders, highly resistant to the wearing forces of the water, in the center drain of each sinkhole. Progressively finer layers of gravel were placed atop the huge boulders until the desired ground level of the muyu was reached, and then a fine layer of topsoil was spread atop the gravel beds. The result was a perfectly level floor that naturally drained itself.
Really? They imported the stone.
They had to. The closest place where we can find this type of rock that has mica on it, it's on the valley down there, Urubamba, which is like an hour from here.
Wow.
Oh, so did they bring it all up by burros or?
No donkeys at that time.
Oh.
Remember, llamas, they only carry a little bit, so it has to be done by man-made.
Wow.
Oh my goodness.
Imagine all those pieces.
Yeah.
Wow.
Next, the inclined slopes of each muyu were sculpted into perfectly concentric terraces, again using gravel and fill on the bottom of each terrace and good topsoil on top to stabilize the terrace. The largest muyu has 8 terraces with intricate stone retaining walls from 8 to 13 feet high. Flying stairs, stones that jut out of the side of each terrace wall at precise locations, allowed graceful transit between the terraces. Precisely engineered to fit between the rows of flying stairs, a single shallow water channel carried spring water from the top of each muyu directly down a prescribed radial and into the bottom of the muyu. This water channel, with its carefully carved stone drops between the levels of terraces, was precisely aligned so that it descended from the top lip of the highest terrace to the bottom floor of the muyu with no lateral diversions. This was a key factor in the team's findings that the water was not brought down to each terrace in an effort to irrigate crops, but rather was specifically being channeled straight down to the bottom level in an effort to keep the water from destabilizing the terraces. The Incas didn't want the water to irrigate crops. They wanted it to flow straight to the bottom level without lubricating the lower levels of each terrace and causing them to collapse. I find this evidence compelling, as well as other hydrologic evidence, such as the Inca actually installed internal drains in the terraces to remove lubricating water from the slip plane of the landslide. Additionally, there were no secondary rows of hydraulic drops to handle the excess irrigation waters, and the terraces often had slopes that were adverse to that purposes. The higher terraces would have required irrigation for crop production, since the 20 inches of annual rainfall were inadequate for the Inca crops, but such irrigation would have produced cascading collapse of the terraces. The team noted several other reasons why they concluded the site was not an agricultural research station, such as its somewhat saline soil and its relatively small size. Also, as already noted, it would have been much easier and more reliable to conduct experiments on the actual sites where the crops would be raised, rather than trying to risk simulating those conditions at Moray. The site had no evidence of utilitarian-type buildings that would have been needed for agricultural purposes. Instead, the building ruins that were found were more high prestige in construction, as was the beautiful circular stonework that surrounded the terraces, and thus more suitable for ceremonial and religious purposes. Also, when scientific soil temperature tests were performed over an extended time, the expected variations that many supposed the different terrace levels would produce did not actually appear. The effects of sunlight exposure and soil moisture cooling due to evaporation had an equalizing effect within the muyu. I have to admit that just like the earlier researchers, my initial default position was to try to find some practical reason for the creation of Moray, beyond just an elaborate religious and ceremonial center. The first time I heard the agricultural research explanation, it made sense to me, although I was troubled by the lack of standing water in the bottom of the Moray. In their book, Wright's team pointed out another muyu nearby known as Green Lake Muyu, where a similar sinkhole developed at a low enough elevation to penetrate the water level and create a lake. Imagine for a moment what would happen if researchers 4 centuries from now discovered our own St. Louis Arch and had no written record of how or why it was created. I suspect they would assume that it had a practical purpose, perhaps as an antenna or some sort of signaling device. How difficult would it be for those future researchers to believe that we just built the arch as a public works project to signify that this area had once served as our country's gateway to the West? I speculate that something analogous happened at Moray, but perhaps with more of a religious connotation than we find with the St. Louis Arch. The Inca worshipped many gods, including the highly revered Pachamama, or Mother Earth. Similar to erecting the giant Christ the Redeemer statue in Rio de Janeiro, I can imagine the Inca leadership casting the creation of Moray as a religious undertaking to honor Pachamama, perhaps by describing the original sinkholes as defects in Pachamama's flesh, similar to acne scars. Now imagine the Inca leadership explaining the task to restore Pachamama's complexion, reshaping the decrepit scars into elaborate 3-dimensional tattoos that celebrate symmetry, geometry, creativity, and harmony. I suspect the Moray project was a gigantic, ongoing public works project similar to our Mount Rushmore endeavor in the 1930s. It kept thousands of able-bodied citizens gainfully employed for years in a sanctified endeavor that both venerated the Inca leadership and glorified their much-beloved god Pachamama. It also kept a sizable force of potential warriors safely employed in the interior of the country, where they were not subject to surprise attack by outside forces, but were close enough to the Inca capital of Cusco to be readily available if needed. So, thank you to the Wright, Zagara, McEwen team, authors of Moray, Inca Engineering Mystery, for bringing hard scientific and engineering data to the solution of the Moray Mysteries, and thank you to our Peruvian guides and friends who intuitively understood the spiritual context of the Moray temples and rightly perceived the ruins as religious centers worthy of the world's admiration.